It's time for Video Game Players Club, the call-in video game podcast. I'm your host, Matthew Schultz. And what is the Video Games Players Club, and why should you listen? The podcast is meant to be a positive voice in gaming. Its primary focus will be on the listener and gamer. I've noticed a trend in gaming enthusiasts who create media for other people to enjoy, where there seems to be a highlight or a focus on mostly the negative experiences in gaming. This could be something in the news that's bad news about a new company, or something about a game that's getting released. But there tends to be a highlight on the negative, I feel like, and a general trend or uptick on negative experiences. So the point of this podcast isn't meant to drum up drama or rage at some gaming news. It's to focus on our experiences in gaming. Good, bad, happy or sad, old memories, or something that just happened yesterday. But always through the lens of each week's topic. Each week, I'll present a topic that will highlight your experiences on that topic by sharing your calls into the show. At the end of each episode, I will present next week's topic and the numerous ways you can call in. You'll have a week's time to call in for a chance to be heard on the next episode. This week's topic was lost game saves. I wanted to hear your best stories about losing a game save. Maybe it was your fault, you forgot to save at a pivotal moment, or a friend erased your save file. So we can kick right into it, actually. Our first story has something to do with a portable game system called the Game Gear, and an unfortunate experience that happened to one of our listeners.
Hi. So this is Daria, and I actually have two short little stories about game saves. The first was, I'd say about maybe 15 years ago or so. I was playing Shining Force Sword of Hygeia on Sega Game Gear. And so I'm sitting there, and sitting in my bedroom, playing my Game Gear, in the dark, and I'm at, like, some pivotal battle. I've got this drink next to me, and I go to pick up the drink, and I'm focused on the screen and not really paying attention to what I'm doing, so I'm kind of, like, blindly trying to put the glass up to my mouth, and I completely miss and smack the side of my Game Gear, and the screen, like, zaps. Like, the light kind of goes, woo, and it's a little line, and I'm like, oh shit, and I get and the water splashes up, and I get it all down the front of my shirt, and it's a huge cock up at this point, and I flip it on real quick to see my save, and it's gone. Like, the entire it didn't just not save the game, it wiped the cartridge completely. I'm like, well, screw this, I'm not going to start the game over again. So what I actually ended up doing was, if you know anything about Shining Force at all, the game was re-released on the Sega CD just with better graphics. So I ended up playing that version instead because I just gave up. I was like, I'm not doing this.
All right, so that was Daria calling in with her first experience, and she's actually going to be on in a minute here talking about another experience she had with a lost game save. So that gives you an idea of kind of what this show is going to be about. We're going to bounce back and forth in between you, the listener, calling in. Video game saves are kind of interesting because right now we think of them one way, and that is that menu pops up, you hit a button, and your progress is saved. But in the past, gaming wasn't always that simple as far as saving your game. And in some ways, the high score at an arcade could have been considered, the first save experience, where your game state, so to speak, was your high score, and if you got, a high enough score, it would be displayed on the arcade machine. And sometimes those saves would only stay as long as that machine was plugged into a power outlet because there wasn't a battery source to back it up. But later on, it pretty much is standard that an arcade machine would keep the save. Let's hop into the next experience that Daria had.
All right, so my second anecdote is a little more recent than the last one. I needed to record some footage of Super Mario RPG, which for those of you that don't know, I run a YouTube channel that does reviews for old classic, JRPGs. And that's, youtube.com/DariaPlaysTOO. I'm going to say a lot, so get used to that. Anyway, so I'm playing Super Mario RPG, and I get as far as, like, the Mole Village, where you're playing kind of like hide and go seek with the Croc character, right before the minecart ride. And I made the mistake of, on an emulator, saving, it's both a save state and saving in the game's, SRAM, which you can't do because as soon as you load up the save state, it wipes the SRAM clean. So next time I go to boot up the game, I couldn't remember how I saved it, and I tried the save state first and completely just screwed up my file. The save was gone forever. But, I'm in the middle of a playthrough. I need this. So what I ended up doing was, online, I went to fantasyanime.com, which they have kind of an archive of save states for a bunch of different role-playing games, all at different points of the game. So I pretty much went to find one as close as to where I was at that point in time, loaded in, and I just went from there.
So the second experience you had is pretty interesting, given that it was on an emulator. What's interesting about that is the way that you can save the state in different ways. Like she had mentioned, she was saving the actual RAM on the game itself. As games moved on, you started to find different ways to save the state of your play, and one of those ways was on the Famicom, which we know as the NES in the United States, was in an actual disc-based solution. Computers would have you save games to magnetic media, either a cassette tape or an actual floppy disk later on. And Nintendo adopted that for the Famicom system. The games that would be brought over to the United States used a battery solution, which in the end would come to bite people in the butt. And you'll see an example of that coming up here in a little bit. But let's move on to another story from a listener, Will, and he's got a story about a PS2 game that he played.
Hey, Matt, this is Will. On the topic of lost saves, it's not necessarily a save that was lost. It was saved, but it was for, like, the Prince of Persia back on PS2. Such a good, amazing, platforming and puzzle adventure game. It was freaking awesome for the time, super, super awesome, good game at the time. And there is a spot where you can save, and I saved there, and it's all right, made a lot of progress, gonna leave it there, and then I came back the next day to load up, and when you save there, it actually breaks the game. The next, area will not ever open. It will never open. Oh. It was a game-breaking save bug. So the save, I guess, broke the game, and honestly, I played it, it was probably 15 or so hours in. I was like, well, I guess that's as much Prince of Persia as I'm going to do. So I guess that's how I handled it. Just never again. Maybe someday, though. All right, bye.
So that's a good story there. And this is common. I mean, this was common in RPGs as well, was the ability to save in a position where, in this case, it was actually game breaking, where if you saved at a certain point and then reloaded from that save, the game was corrupted. But it would happen in RPGs where sometimes you would get to a certain level in your experience or a part of the stage where there was no going back. And so you'd end up in a scenario where if you saved and then reloaded from that point, you'd be under-leveled, or there'd be some condition that you couldn't meet in order to continue on to the game. And one thing that I find interesting about this particular topic is the idea of how do you react to that? Since this show is new, I think people will get more of an idea of what the feel of this show will kind of flesh out a bit more. But Will gave us a hint as to how he felt about it, which is basically dejected and he just wanted to stop. And I think that's a pretty common reaction, actually. Our next story comes from CrossChop Chris, and he's a YouTuber. Daria Plays was another YouTuber. You should check them both out. And his story is interesting. It's another portable console system.
This is Chris from CrossChop. My YouTube channel is CrossChop Chris, youtube.com/CrossChopChris. And my most memorable loss of a game save comes from when I was a wee lad. I was playing Donkey Kong Land 2. I'd received a brand new copy of that from my aunt and uncle. And I'd instantly fallen in love with the game. I remember playing it quite a bit when I first got it. I believe the 4 AA batteries in my original Game Boy, it was a clear model, by the way, nice, had burst, or one of them had anyway. And I'd never experienced that before, but I remember discovering it. I guess I hadn't played in maybe a few days or something like that, but I found that a battery or batteries in the back of my Game Boy had burst. And I distinctly remember that the Donkey Kong Land 2 cartridge was in my Game Boy at the time, and it never quite worked reliably after that. I was never able to save my game. I could play the game okay, but I think there was maybe one time on a road trip that I was actually still able to save my game. So otherwise, I was very frustrated by this, naturally. This was a game that I had already made significant progress in. I think I had gotten to the third world or so, and it had gotten pretty difficult. For fans of the Super Nintendo games, Donkey Kong Country 2, you know that's a pretty difficult one. There was a definite difficulty spike that became apparent in the second and third worlds. But, I was never able to fully save again. I think it might have worked briefly for me and got my hopes up at one point. I was able to maintain a save for maybe a few hours even, something like that. I would save my game, turn the Game Boy off, turn it back on again, and my save was there. But if I had it off for more than a few hours or a day or so, my save was gone. So essentially, I came to accept that my cartridge was still playable, but I couldn't rely on it to preserve my progress. So I kind of just adapted. I'd hoped that eventually someday I would get a replacement cartridge for it, which I now do have. I don't know exactly what I did with my original old cartridge, but essentially what I did was I treated it as kind of an arcade style experience. I would only play that cartridge on road trips, or if I was locked into a time period where I knew I'd have enough time to make some progress in the game, but I never actually beat it. But that's kind of been one of those sore subjects for me. It's a point of frustration, but also a point of nostalgia for remembering those car rides where I would pop in the cartridge, hoping against hope that it would eventually work again, but knowing full well that it probably would not. It's a quality game. I've always loved it. But yeah, it definitely caused some frustration during those times.
So Chris's story is one of someone who, despite the condition of potentially losing the save again and again and again, he kept going at it. And it sounds like it was partially because, you're on that car trip. What are you going to do but play your Game Boy? But I do love the persistence, and that's definitely something that's in the heart of a child, I feel like, as far as not wanting to give up and just continue on. I almost feel like the way that you handle a lost save as you get older is to just accept it and decide, are you going to continue or not? But it's a conscious decision. As a child, it might be more brute or automatic, where you just think, I'm just going to keep playing because that's what I want to do. As you get older, though, time and availability changes how you make those kinds of decisions. But I wanted to give a little bit more on the history side of game saves. And I just wanted to touch on the change and the transition from saves that were on a cartridge, and as we moved over to disc media, the save itself migrated from an actual physical spot on the cartridge that was retained with a battery to a memory card. And I can chip in here with my own personal story of lost game save, and it actually has nothing to do with the game itself as far as like corrupting the save or anything like that. It was actually just physically losing the memory card. I don't remember. The thing for me was, When you lose a memory card, you're not just losing one game save. You're losing many. At that point, the grief and the feeling of loss is much higher because you've lost many game saves, not just one, though probably you were working on one particular game at the time. So my lost game save memory is mostly to do with that one memory card that got away. And in particular, I lost a save to Final Fantasy Tactics, which will be mentioned here in another story here briefly. I'm going to go ahead and jump into our next call from Brandon. And this is a very interesting technical loss of a game save. And I'm going to go into detail on what actually happens when this type of loss in a game save occurs. But let's go to his story first.
Well, I have several stories about lost game saves, but I think the one that impacted me the most, or perhaps made me the most prepared for lost game saves, was when, as a kid, I was playing Tecmo Super Bowl on the Super Nintendo, and back in those days, you could save your progress over the course of your seasons, but you had to hold reset and turn off the power before ejecting the game cartridge. And even when you did it, it wasn't 100% accurate. And I recall playing for probably 4 or 5 seasons on one particular setting, and because you could go through the seasons, obviously not more as in depth as the Madden games now, but in my mind, I had a storied history and overcoming adversity because I wasn't that great at the game yet. And when I started up the next time and it was reset, I think it prepared me better for losing game saves in the future with the advent of memory cards, because I was prepared for the idea that even when you put your heart and soul into this, it's not 100% accurate that it's going to stay there. And that's how I dealt with it. I didn't bother starting over for months. I just put the game down and started something else. Because it was too painful to start over all over.
Yeah, so that's an interesting story, and this is actually something that I'm sure that a lot of you older gamers can recall happening and maybe didn't know why it had actually happened. And his example is especially rare, actually, because it happened on a Super NES, which had protections in place to try to prevent this kind of thing from happening. But basically, if you didn't hold down the reset button on the NES when you were dealing with a game that would save to the cart, you ran the chance of actually losing the game save. And a lot of people think that this has to do with an electric spike of some sort that wipes the memory of the save or something like that. But I looked into this, and it was actually quite hard to find a good technical explanation, but I managed to find one that I thought made a lot of sense and is probably the most accurate description of what's happening on the forums at ZSNES.com by user Wicker, and this was actually back in 2004, I believe. And he essentially says that what's going on is there's a certain amount of volts running through the cartridge in the console, and when you press the power button, in that split second time, what's actually happening is the hardware is losing power, even though you see the light go off instantaneously. In that fraction of a second, what's happening is the CPU on the NES goes into kind of like a death throw, and it starts sending off random signals as a result. He calls it goes spastic almost. And as a result of that, it can read and write to random locations. And for a normal NES cartridge without a battery save, that's no big deal. But if it happens to touch some of those bad points on the NES cartridge with a battery save, you're going to have problems, obviously. So what you actually were encouraged to do was hold down the reset button as you would power off an NES game that used a battery backup. And that would set the console into a low power mode that would prepare it for the power being shut off and would prevent this kind of weird death throw corruption from happening. The SNES allowed for cartridges to have something called a MAD1 chip. And this would allow the cartridge to have a layer of protection to prevent this from occurring. But this wasn't on all the cartridges, and apparently for this particular game that Brandon's talking about, it wasn't there, and so he happened to lose his game save. But I thought that was an interesting an actual technical reason for why that would happen on the older NES and some of the SNES games. Here's the part where I pitch next week's topic that I'd like for you to call in on. I'm really hoping I get some unsolicited calls. Next week's topic is about what was your first RPG experience? What was it like? How did it make you feel? Were you confused? Did you just stop right away? Was this something that got you hooked for life? What confused you the most? Unless you were somebody who maybe played D&D, all of the concepts in an RPG were basically new. If you're a younger gamer, your experience with leveling mechanics and those kinds of things are fresh and you know what they are basically. They're in everything now. They're in baseball games. They're in practically everything. Shooters. All those mechanics have now leaked into gaming in general. But what was your first RPG experience? That's what I want to hear. And this is how you can call in. You can go to Skype and add Video Game Players Club, no spaces, or you can dial 805-351-CLUB. That's 805-351-2582. And both of those will take you to the same line. You'll have a recap of what that week's topic is, and there you can leave your story. But call in, tell your friends to call in. Just give me your story. I want to hear it. I want to put you on the show, and I want to talk about it. So now I'm going to jump into a different part of the show. And this part of the show I'm calling Continue. It's kind of the bookend to the whole podcast. The concept of this portion of the podcast is to talk about gaming in the real world, so to speak. So media, maybe a DVD documentary or a book or a person that maybe is a gamer or something to do with gaming that isn't video games directly, but touches the world of video gaming. And this episode, I took it upon myself to contact a good buddy of mine, Brasel The Gamer. He's a YouTuber. You can find him on YouTube by searching Brasel The Gamer. And he's also a writer. He writes a lot, more than I do. That's for sure. And he writes on Gaming Rebellion. He has a special series of articles on Retroware, and he has his own blog that he writes on. But his main thing is YouTube. And so this interview primarily focuses on that, but also touches on just being a gamer in general. What inspired you to start making videos on YouTube?
I had started watching guys like Angry Video Game Nerd, who's the person everybody talks about, Pat the NES Punk, and I really got into their stuff. I remember specifically, I was watching through the Angry Video Game Nerd's library, and I was getting really antsy about the fact that I didn't have any of my games anymore, because every time he went to his shelf and he showed all his games, I was like, oh man, I want my games back.
Yeah.
And then Pat the NES Punk came on. One of his, he was like a guest on one of his videos, and so then I kind of dove down that rabbit hole, and then I just kept going, and I just kept watching all these content creators, and I got to a point where I ran across, and I'm just gonna go ahead and say who it is because I don't really care. I came across the Super Mario Brothers 2 review by the Irate Gamer.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, you know what? I want to make videos. I want to make YouTube videos. So I started collecting again. And then I ordered this Chinese knockoff Easy Cap for $7 online on Amazon.
Yeah.
And, or eBay. I don't remember where it was. And, I just kept watching, just consuming all these YouTube videos, getting all these ideas, watching people like Irate Gamer and thinking, I could do better than this.
Yeah.
Because, he was shitting on Super Mario Brothers 2. And I'm like, this isn't a bad game. And I know for him it was more about comedy or whatever. But I mean, at the time, I'm just like, no, you're doing it all wrong. So I wrote my first episode. And I did my first episode on Super Mario Brothers 2, kind of defending it. And yeah, that's kind of what inspired me to start. It was just watching a bunch of other people and just thinking, I've got things to say about games that people haven't talked about, that people haven't covered. And I'm a kind of a creative guy. I'm sure I could do something with video editing. I just need to figure out how to do it. And I did.
So yeah, like I had gone back to your earlier stuff, and that Mario Maker video, was that you and your brother doing that together, or was he like, was that like early video making Tony, or?
Oh, the Mario Paint video.
Yeah, sorry, the Mario Paint video. Yeah.
Yeah, the Mario Paint video. Oh yeah, man. We made Mario Paint movies back in, it had to have been 93, 94. We started making Mario Paint movies. We had a neighbor kid who came over, and we did this really awful movie called Jason Lingo, or The Adventures of Jason Lingo. And it was based off a kid he knew from his church that he hated. And okay, so this kid that we hung out with was kind of a bully too, but not to us, but he was to other people.
Right.
And it was just weird because, he just really wanted to pick on this kid. So he like came up with like all this awful stuff about this kid. And
so it was like therapy.
It was, I guess. And then so he had us like do voices in the movie and everything, and we helped him with like creative decisions. We didn't actually like do anything other than voice the characters. So we voiced characters. We put like actual music in and everything, and yeah, it was a lot of fun. So me and my brother started doing them on our own. And, we didn't have nearly the same chops as this neighbor kid did, because this neighbor kid was a couple years older than me, actually.
Yeah.
And
so, I mean, when you started producing the YouTube stuff, was that really kind of your first, besides, being young and messing around with VHS tape and a VCR and plugging the Super Nintendo through it, was that kind of your first introduction into video production in general, or had you?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah. I had never done anything like it before. I think the closest I'd come was like making silly slideshows or something on PowerPoint.
Yeah.
And I think I had tried to make a video on Windows Movie Maker once a couple years prior to that, like for a family thing or something. I can't even remember what it was, but I didn't even get I didn't even get 10% of the way into it. I was just like, I don't know how to do this, and I don't want to do this. So I didn't. So yeah, I mean, the YouTube channel that I did now, that's the first time I'd ever started messing with video production or anything like that. Yeah. Voiceover or anything.
You mentioned your brother and playing games with him, and like your parents and the like Zelda, and how your father and mother played that, and how your mom would help you on Iceman, and then watch you play Princess Tomato and all that kind of stuff. What do you think makes someone want to keep video games in their life, and another person, they maybe loved it when they were a kid, but they just leave it behind as like maybe a hobby or whatever? Like what kept you going?
I think for me it was kind of a form of escapism. I wouldn't necessarily say that I had a bad childhood, because I didn't. In hindsight I didn't, but I was a pretty angsty teenager.
Yeah. And
of course I was all woe is me, I have it terrible, my life sucks, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
It didn't. But, looking back, I know that now. But back then I thought everything was the worst thing in the world. And it was kind of a form of escapism to get away from my troubles, and I just kept playing it. And I'd get so engrossed in these stories, particularly like Final Fantasy games and stuff.
Yeah.
I really got into the RPGs because of the story. Because of the story and the music and the atmosphere and the fantasy worlds and everything. And it was just something that just sucked me in. I was just really all about getting out of my regular everyday life and getting sucked in somewhere else, I guess.
Yeah.
I think the family stuff reinforced that. I almost want to say it enabled it. Like, not in a good way, just because, my parents had kind of grown out of it by the time I was a teenager, they didn't play games much anymore.
Yeah.
And but they'd still buy me the stuff. They'd still, let me play it. And my dad would get kind of upset when I got older that I was spending so much time in video games.
Yeah.
But,
was your first console was the NES?
Yes.
Yeah. And was that by request, or was that your parents got it just to have?
It was by request. My neighbor had gotten one, and he had Super Mario Brothers 2.
Yeah.
And then a couple other people I knew got them. They had like Mario Brothers and Duck Hunt and Metroid, and Cybernoid was one of them. One of the first games I played. DuckTales.
Yeah. Oh man.
And it was just like, oh, I've got to have this. And then I saw the graphics for the Master System in the the JCPenney's Christmas catalog. Like, oh no, I want that version of the Ghostbusters game that's coming out.
Yeah,
that's out. And my parents were like, no, you're not getting that. My guess is they had already bought me the NES.
Right. Yeah. Early on, you did a lot of videos on Mega Man, and now you've kind of actually revisited Mega Man again, and you're doing a series on that. For you, what makes Mega Man so special?
I think a big part of it really was that early interaction with not just my parents or my mom in particular, but the neighborhood kids. When I first played Mega Man 2, like everybody was playing Mega Man 2 in my neighborhood, and we'd go to each other's houses and we'd help each other beat a robot master that couldn't be beat, or we'd find out what, who is weak to what, because we talked to each other about the game.
Right.
And I mean, that's kind of what started my fascination with it. Everybody else was playing it and everybody else was having such a good time with Mega Man 2. And then, see, I don't know, because I'm not really a sci-fi guy. I'm not really that into sci-fi and that kind of thing. But for whatever reason, just the gameplay, the really solid gameplay that I played so much of as a kid, and I just got better and better.
Yeah.
So I did a fan website of it on GeoCities.
Yeah.
And Angel Fire back in the day, and then I kind of ran into that community. So I don't know. I think it's just it's a lot of interactions with other people, and that's what kind of made me love Mega Man.
Yeah. It seems like one of those games where as you play it, especially when you're younger, it was a game that it felt like you were earning its respect.
Yes.
Because you had
that makes sense.
Yeah, you had to get so much better at it. So for people that are looking to start up a YouTube channel about video games or just getting started, what's a piece of advice that when you were getting started that you had wish you would have had?
Well, a piece of advice that I wish I would have had was, and it's a little more specific to me, and that's kind of weird, I know. I mean, I kind of wish I knew I would have gotten really into it, because I would have invested more in it to start. You've been watching my older videos recently, and you see like the quality of the gameplay footage and the quality of the camera and the voice is not good. I would tell people one thing I would recommend, just from my experience, and I kind of did it right. It wasn't something that I did wrong. Don't be afraid to ease your way into it, I guess. If you buy the cheap capture card to start, and you buy, and you just have a laptop laying around, don't be afraid to start out your channel with some really shit looking videos. You'll get better. The more you do it, the better you'll get. Right.
Yeah.
I guess that's my big piece of advice. It's not something I guess I wish I would have known.
Yeah, I mean, it's honing your craft, right? You got to kind of put.
Yeah.
One thing I notice about you is you're able to continuously produce content on basically a regular basis, which I think is one of the keys to doing videos on YouTube. What do you do to keep motivated and not get burnt out on producing videos?
Well, I can't lie. I think one of the big reasons that I'm able to keep going is the feedback I get. just the positive reinforcement that I get from the community. People like my videos, so it makes me want to continue to make them.
Yeah.
Another part of it is this week I haven't touched video stuff at all this week because I realized I'd been working really hard the last couple weeks on video stuff. I was just like, you know what, I need to take a break this week.
Yeah.
So I haven't touched videos this week. And I think a lot of people will try to go and just not stop, and they won't stop and take a break. And then they get burnt out, and then they won't put a video out for like 3 months or 6 months or a year, or they never come back, or they do come back, but then they only do it for a video, and then they're just completely burnt out on it. I think the big thing there for me to avoid burnout is I do take frequent breaks. Every fourth or fifth week, it seems like I'm like, no, I'm not going to do anything this week. I'm just going to sit back and play video games, or I'm going to watch TV or do something else.
This week's topic is about lost game saves.
Okay.
And do you have any memorable stories about losing a game save or?
Yes, I do. It's oh my God. Okay, so Final Fantasy Tactics for the PlayStation 1.
Oh no.
I got to the very last chapter on that game, and I had a third-party Mega memory card. Okay.
Oh God.
Okay, and it had like a little LCD screen on it. I didn't really know what it did.
Yeah.
Or an LED. I'm sorry. It had it looked like there was a big 0 on it whenever I plugged it in.
Yeah.
And I don't know why it did that. I didn't know why it did that.
I think I know where this is headed.
Yeah. So somehow I changed the page on the memory card, and I didn't know that was a thing. So I went to go load up my Final Fantasy Tactics game, and it was gone. And I freaked the fuck out. And I was like, you know what? That's okay. I really fucking love this game, so I'm going to play it again.
Yeah.
So I got back to close to where I was before, and then it happened again. And I was like, what the hell is happening? Now it says 2. And I was like, wait a minute. This thing has pages, doesn't it? And I figured out how to switch between the pages. Oh, and I found my old game. I had played to the 4th chapter twice.
It's like 60 hours or something.
Yeah.
Oh, God.
But, yeah, that was my lost game save adventure story from when I was a kid.
That's a good one.
Yeah.
Well, I just want to thank you, Tony, for being on. And how can people find you?
You can find me pretty much anywhere by searching for Brasel the Gamer. If you want to find my Twitter, I'm at Brasel the Gamer. If you want to find my Facebook, I'm facebook.com/Brasel the Gamer. On YouTube, just search for Brasel the Gamer. I've got a very easily searchable name, so as long as you search my name in Google, you'll find me.
All right. It was nice talking to you, man.
Yep.
So that wraps up this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. You can catch us on Twitter at VGPlayersClub, or you can find us at videogameplayersclub.com. The episode will post on iTunes as well as Google Music, and pretty much any podcast system in the world you'll be able to find it. You can also find us on YouTube by just searching Video Game Players Club. Anyways, thank you for listening to the very first episode. I really hope you call in. I'll see you next episode.